Welcome to Tales in the Dark, where real-life encounters reveal the shadows lurking just beyond the familiar. In Story 3, we step into the world of a high school senior whose forbidden romance opens the door to something sinister. What starts as a stolen night at his girlfriend's house quickly unravels into a nightmare of dark figures and unshakable dread, leaving him haunted by a presence that refuses to let go. Get ready for It Followed Me from My Girlfriend's Home, and remember, if you crave chilling tales that linger long after the last word, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Now, let's descend into the shadows. Story 3. It Followed Me from My Girlfriend's Home. It was the fall of my senior year, back in the early 90s in Fresno, California, when I first started dating her. Back then, dating wasn't just complicated, it was forbidden. In my culture, there were strict, unspoken rules about how boys and girls were supposed to interact. Getting caught wasn't just a risk of getting into trouble. It could mean real consequences. Her family would shame her, pushing for a marriage neither of us wanted. They'd even drag my family into it, stirring up a whole mess with clan leaders, trying to force us into a future we hadn't chosen. The only time we had to ourselves was at school. We'd meet between classes, quick glances and whispered words in the hallways, or maybe steal a few minutes together at lunch. Those moments felt like stolen treasure, rare and fragile. But even those few minutes weren't enough. I wanted to know more, to share more. Still, with her family, talking on the phone was nearly impossible. In those days, there were no cell phones. Her entire family shared one phone line, and every time we tried to talk, her mom was on the other line, listening. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, she'd pull out an old corded phone she kept hidden, plug it into her room's outlet, and call me. I'd wait, quiet in the dark, listening for her voice. It was our only time, just us in the silence, as if the world couldn't reach us there. I couldn't call her. Her mom never would have allowed it. On the rare nights we managed to speak, I could hear her mom's presence on the line, an almost tangible weight, as though she were waiting, listening, always ready to pull the phone away. One night, we were talking on the phone, voices low, both of us barely above a whisper to avoid waking anyone up. Our conversation drifted into stories of the paranormal, each of us sharing experiences we'd heard or things we thought we'd seen. I wasn't expecting anything serious, just a way to pass the time. But then she paused, her voice dropping even lower. To my surprise, she told me she thought her house was haunted and believed it was by a young female ghost. She'd seen the figure of a girl at night, usually when everyone else was asleep. Sometimes, she'd hear footsteps in the hallway. Other times, she'd feel a presence moving through her room. At first, she'd been scared, but over time, she'd grown used to it, brushing it off like it was just part of the house. I listened, intrigued but unconvinced. The story of the ghost girl stayed with me for a moment, but after we hung up, I didn't think much of it. As the days went by, her story faded to the back of my mind. Toward the end of my senior year, my parents bought an extra car for the family, a 1986 Toyota Camry. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was freedom, and it became more than just a car. With it, I could finally see her outside of school, at least on weekends, even if we were under the constant watch of her family. Her parents were as strict as ever, and whenever I visited, we had to sit in the living room, where everything felt tense, eyes always on us. Her mom would hover just out of sight, but we knew she was there, listening to every word, watching every move. It was far from how I'd imagined spending time with her, and each visit felt like balancing on a knife's edge, trying to relax while her mom's presence loomed just out of sight. But we found a way. We'd watch for her parents' schedules, slipping in little visits when they weren't home. Those moments were rare, but they were ours, and finally, we could just be together without feeling someone's eyes always on us. One summer night, she called me with news that felt like a gift. Her parents were leaving town, off to a funeral in another city, and wouldn't be back until the next day. They planned to leave around evening, once her dad got home from work. It felt like a rare chance, the kind that didn't come around for us. And after they left, I couldn't hold back any longer. I decided I had to go see her. It was already close to 10 p.m. when I pulled up to her house. For the first time, a strange chill ran through me just being there. Her house looked different at night, and not in a good way. The streetlights cast long, crooked shadows across the yard, and her front door lights threw strange shapes onto the grass, twisting and stretching until they looked almost like figures standing in the dark corners. I brushed it off, figuring it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I walked up the path to her door, the feeling stayed, a prickling at the back of my neck that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. It was as if something or someone was watching hidden deep in those shadows. We spent a while talking in her living room, her siblings scattered around us. Even though her parents weren't home, I was careful not to break any rules. Her siblings had become the eyes and ears for her parents, and as long as we stayed in sight and out of her room, the worst that would happen would be a lecture later on. After a while, she decided to give me a tour of her house. We stepped out to the backyard, walking toward the garage and her mom's little garden. When we passed by the garden, I noticed the way the backlight cast a shadow toward the small patch of corn her mom grew. At first, I figured it was just the corn's shadow, but something about it seemed wrong. The shape was slightly off, like it wasn't just plants casting that shadow. My heart started beating faster as we walked toward it. I kept staring at the figure, but when I glanced at her for a second and looked back, it was gone. Trying to keep my cool, I suggested we head back inside. We settled into the living room, watching TV with only the kitchen light on in the dining room nearby. That's when I noticed, just at the edge of my vision, a woman's figure standing in the shadow at the entrance of the hallway. My pulse quickened, and I thought back to the shadow I'd seen outside. I glanced around, counting her siblings one by one, making sure everyone was accounted for. A chill ran down my spine as I realized everyone was in the living room with us. Whatever I kept seeing at the edge of my vision wasn't one of her siblings. Uneasy and thinking about the late-night drive home, I decided I couldn't ignore the feeling any longer. I said my goodbyes quickly, giving her one last look before stepping out into the night. Leaving her house gave me a strange mix of relief and dread. I was already rattled by everything I'd seen and couldn't shake the stories I'd heard about ghosts following people home if they weren't careful. The thought lingered, gnawing at me as I walked to my car. As soon as I climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door, I heard a faint shuffle from the back seat. It sounded like someone, or something, had climbed in behind me. My body froze, every muscle tense, and for a few seconds I couldn't move. Finally, I reached up and switched on the overhead light, bracing myself as I turned around. But there was no one there, just the empty back seat, staring back at me. The drive home was unbearable. All I could think about was that shadow in her backyard, the ghostly figure I'd glimpsed in the hallway. I kept every light in my car on, gripping the wheel with hands that were cold and shaky. My heart raced, my skin prickling with goosebumps, as I watched the rearview mirror, half expecting something to appear every time I glanced at it. The music was blasting, a desperate attempt to drown out any sound from outside. But even with the noise, the shadows cast by streetlights loomed and twisted, turning each moment into a living nightmare. Every dark patch seemed ready to spring to life, like someone or something was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When I got home, I could finally breathe again, relieved to be back in the safety of my own space. For the first time that night, I felt like I could let go of the fear that had clung to me. But that sense of relief was short-lived. Later, when I went to bed, I experienced something I'd never felt before: sleep paralysis. In the dead of night, I woke to the sound of someone walking in my room. My heart pounded as I forced my eyes open, scanning the dark until I saw her, the black shadow of a woman standing beside my bed. Before I could process what was happening, I felt a heavy weight press down on me, like someone had laid on top of me, pinning me against the mattress. I tried to move, to scream, to kick, anything to break free, but my body was frozen, completely trapped. I struggled, panic rising with each second, until finally, as if some invisible force had released me, I broke free. That night, I slept with the lights on, and from then on, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in darkness. The experience didn't stop. It haunted me for about a week. Every night, the moment I drifted off, I'd find myself in a nightmare where she would appear again, trapping me in a state of sleep paralysis. The figure grew closer each time, the weight heavier, as if she were reaching out from the dream to claim something from me. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. Finally, I told my parents about my experience at my girlfriend's house and everything that had been happening since. They weren't happy, and I got the lecture of a lifetime, but they listened. Understanding the weight of what I'd been through, they reached out to a local shaman to perform a traditional Hmong ceremony. The days that followed felt lighter, and for the first time in a week, I finally slept without fear. Everything seemed to return to normal. But about a week later, as I was talking to my girlfriend around midnight, I heard something strange. A faint woman's voice in the background, just barely audible. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I asked my girlfriend if one of her siblings was still awake, maybe in the room with her. She told me everyone was asleep. My heart sank, and in that moment, I realized that whatever had followed me hadn't left her house after all. The fear crept back, stronger than before. I knew what I had to do. Without telling her the details of what had happened to me, or why, I decided it was best to end things. I couldn't bear the thought of that shadow finding me again, lurking in the corners of my room, waiting. So I broke up with her, leaving that chapter behind. I never told her about the night that followed my visit, or the shadowed figure that had haunted my dreams. As we close the chapter on the chilling tale of young love haunted by an unseen presence, we're reminded that sometimes the unknown latches onto us without warning or reason, lingering long after the moment has passed. For our young protagonist, what began as a love bound by secrecy ended in a confrontation with the supernatural, a shadow that reached across the boundary between this world and the next. When faced with such encounters, letting go and creating distance can be our only shield against what might reattach itself. Because in the end, keeping yourself safe, free from the grasp of the unseen, is what matters most. If this haunting tale has left you yearning for more journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Here on Tales in the Dark, the line between the living and the beyond is thin, and another story is always waiting.